Thursday. It's the final day of shows here for January of 2025. And here on Thursdays on Texas Football Today, we like to celebrate a segment we call
Math Tuesday.
Math Tuesday.
Math Tuesday.
It's Math Tuesday here on Texas Football Today, where we dive into the numbers of Texas high school football across the state of Texas. And we are still recapping and keeping an eye on what happened in the year of our Lord 2024 in the Texas high school football season. And one of the things that we hear a lot around these parts is essentially people like to know who the best teams are, right? Obviously, we put out the program rankings. We have our in-season rankings, the official rankings partner of the Associated Press. People like to stack their teams up against one another. That's the whole point. My team's better than your team. And inevitably, as a great man once said, you are what your record says you are, but there's another level to that, which is like, oh yeah, but like, who have you played, right? Who have you played? You hear that a lot in college football whenever it gets to college football playoff time of who should be in and who should be out based on who you played and what your strength of schedule is. And certainly that should play a part in it. And especially, I would say, in Texas high school football, where the quality of schedule, I think, can be very disparate, okay? For example, I think if you're in the NFL, take the NFL, for example, and you are 10-0, if you have two 10-0 teams, like there is maybe a difference in what your schedule looks like, but in the end, being 10-0 is being 10-0.
Yeah,
right?
And you're amongst professional teams. All of those are professional football players.
The worst NFL team, who's the worst NFL? Who's got the number one picks? The Giants?
Yeah, I think
maybe?
so.
Okay, the Giants, okay? The Giants are still an extremely good football team. They're just bad for the NFL, right? In high school football, what I would argue is that being 10-0, one team being 10-0 versus another team being 10-0 are not necessarily the same thing. And you also see this whenever the rankings come out. And we hear this all the time. How do you have a team that has a loss or multiple losses ahead of a team that's undefeated? Right? And the answer for us usually is like, okay, yeah, who have you played? Like strength of schedule. Maybe we're waiting for more data. But that does kind of lead us to the question, which is which teams were the most battle-tested in 2024 in Texas high school football? Which teams went out there and played the toughest schedule now after the fact? And there were some teams that we knew looking at their schedule, it turned out it was going to be a tough schedule, and it was. There were other teams that I think we saw their schedule and go, wow, that's brutal. And then after the fact, you look at it and you go, well, yeah, but some of the teams they played ended up not being as good as we thought they were going to be, right? And then there's also kind of, I think, the flip side, which is some teams that we looked at their schedule and said, well, that's nothing special. And it turned out that it ended up being loaded with absolutely spectacular football teams that made them one of the toughest schedules in the state. And so I want to take a look at which teams in Texas high school football in 2024 played the toughest schedule. We're going to measure this in a couple of different ways. The first way I want to do it is as basic as it gets, which is how many wins did your opponents have? Okay? Plain and simple, how many wins did your opponents have over the course of the season? Who played the most winningest ball clubs, right? And the answer here is Salina. So Salina went 16-0, won the 4A Division I state championship. Their opponents won 141 games. Okay, 141 games, which means their opponents averaged 8.8 wins per team, per opponent.
That's
pretty darn good.
Yeah.
Pretty darn good. Aubrey, a district rival, by the way, is right behind them at 8.7 wins per opponent. Brownwood, another team kind of from that neck of the woods, played a brutal schedule. They only went 6-5, but their opponents averaged 8.7 wins per team. Atascocita, I think not a surprise to see them on here, right? 12-2, they played 121 teams that won 121 games. Vanderbilt Industrial went 2-8, but they can look at their schedule and say, yeah, but we played a schedule that averaged 8.6 wins per team, per opponent that we played. Newcastle in the six-man ranks, 7-5, won a playoff game. Their opponents won an average of 103 games, or rather 8.5 wins per team. They won 103 games. And same thing, by the way, Galena Park North Shore. You look at that, 14-1. They won 128 games, an average of 8.5 wins per opponent. And you can look at that and say, okay, well, Salina played the toughest schedule. And I think you would be within your rights to say that. I will, however, throw out one big caveat here. And I think maybe you may be able to spot it, which is, as you progress in the playoffs, aren't you playing better teams? Like when you get into the state semifinals, right? Even a team like Joaquin, which was a huge surprise making it to the state semifinals, right? They had 10 wins. So as you progress through the playoffs, you're playing better and better teams that have bigger and bigger gross win totals, right? And so maybe this isn't the most accurate comparison and most accurate measure of which teams played the toughest schedule. What about instead, because the other thing is that isn't that just a measure of how far you went? Salina played 16 games. They played in a state semifinal. Against a Canyon West Plains team that won, I think, 13 games, right? They're getting credit for that other teams aren't. Kilgore played in the state, they played Kilgore in a state championship game. Kilgore was a team that won 13 games, right? They're getting credit that, plain and simple, a team like Brownwood never got to that point. If they had kept winning, that's not necessarily a measure of the schedule, but maybe a measure of how far they went. And so the next thing I want to look at is maybe a measure of the winning percentage. Okay, which teams played opponents with the greatest combined winning percentage? And at the top, you've got a pair of six-man teams. Newcastle, we already talked about them. Their opponents went 103-38. Okay, a 730 win percentage. That's pretty brutal. Pretty brutal. And Newcastle certainly was very battle tested, and we knew kind of going into that. Another one that I think is very interesting here is Klondike. We kind of flagged them early as saying, hey, they were 0-4, but don't bury them. That's because they played Knox City, Jayton, Happy, and Whiteface. Okay? Those weeks 2 through 4, Jayton, Happy, and Whiteface, those two teams finished a combined 39-3. Okay? They ended up playing a schedule that went 117-48, including playing that Jayton team again, who ended up playing for a state championship game, playing a state championship. Midland Legacy, you take a look at their schedule. Their opponents went 93-39 this year, and yes, they only went 6-6, and certainly that's not the standard that we know Clint Hartman wants to have out there at Legacy. But when you take a look at playing Allen, a 13-1 team, Euless Trinity, an 11-2 team, Lake Travis, a 12-2 team, right? Those games, that really adds up, right? You add in Wolford Friendship, and then they ended up playing Euless Trinity again in an area round matchup. They got battle tested. We talk about Aubrey, right? We talked about them. 114-48 was their opponent's record. Down in the Valley, it was a bad year for San Benito. Nobody's going to say that 2-8, 2-9 is exactly what they're looking at or what they want. But look at their schedule: 10-2 PSJA North, 14-2 Austin Westlake, 15-1 Carthage, right? 10-2 Los Fresnos. Okay, they played a brutal schedule. Westlake on that list as well, Atascocita again, and then Rogers. Rogers went 120, played an opponent, or their opponent's record was the same as Atascocita, 687. So certainly these are teams that were battle tested as well. There's one other way to measure this, and I think this is pretty interesting. When you take a look at, because these are obviously based on how these teams did, but if you want to get into the weeds, yeah, Klondike, their opponents won 117 games, but who did those teams play, right? One of the things that we utilize here is the Dave Campbell's Texas Football Computer. We talk about that, and it's basically an ELO system, which says it measures basically how well you did against the team and then how well that team does. Essentially kind of a dynamic metric of how well your schedule is shaping up. And so what I want to look at are the teams that, according to the Dave Campbell's Texas Football Computer, played the toughest schedule in each classification. And this may be a little surprising to you.
Yeah, it is.
In 6A, it's Atascocita. So we talked about their opponent's record was 121-55, right? Mm-hmm. Look at who they played. They played North Shore twice, Katy, Westlake, and Summer Creek. I think this is not a surprise.
I could have guessed that. Yes. And it's funny because all season long we said Atascocita, pound for pound, has the most impressive resume out of any team at any point in time.
And sure enough, they have, according to the computer, they have the best. They play the toughest schedule in Texas high school football of any classification.
And Westlake and Summer Creek were both on the road.
Summer Creek, yeah. I mean, I want you to think about that. North Shore was a state semifinalist, played them twice. Westlake, a state finalist. Summer Creek, a state semifinalist. Mm-hmm. Brutal schedule. In 5A, it was Highland Park. Highland Park, of course, played Smithson Valley in that state championship game. But they also played Denton Ryan, Lovejoy, Frisco Lone Star. Their schedule was very tough. Very, very tough. And that doesn't count, by the way, the only other team they lost to besides Smithson Valley, which is a team from Colorado, Cherry Creek, which I think went on to win a Colorado state championship. We don't have a way of measuring them, but certainly if you want to put that credit in there put that in their credit, I think you could. Mm-hmm. In 4A, we've mentioned them a ton. It's Aubrey. Okay, Aubrey went 8-5, and the reason that they end up being at the very top of this list is in 4A is because specifically of District 7. We knew District 7 was tough. They played Salina twice, played them in the regular season and in the playoffs. They played Frisco Panther Creek in district, right? They played Brock in non-district, a team that played in a state semifinal. And then they played Sulphur Springs, which is a 10-3 team. They're, according to the Dave Campbell's Texas Football Computer, certainly by virtue of playing Salina twice, that helped. But Aubrey played the toughest schedule in 4A. In 3A, it was Hitchcock. Hitchcock, of course, played a brutal schedule within their own district with Columbus, right? They ended up playing, Columbus in district play and ended up handing them their only loss of the year in overtime. But then you add in that they played Franklin in the third round of the playoffs. You add in that they played Belleville in non-district. You add in they played Hampshire Fannett in non-district. They played Silsbee in non-district. They loaded up a brutal, brutal schedule and ended up having the toughest schedule in 3A, according to the Dave Campbell's Texas Football Computer. This one caught me by surprise, but in 2A, it was Hemphill. Okay, and you're thinking, this is the first time I've thought about Hemphill this year. And certainly, look, Brandon Lane's ball clubs went 1-9, okay? They won a game against an out-of-state team and went 0-9 against Texas teams. And I get it. But look at the schedule that they played. And a lot of this comes back to playing in District 11, 2A Division 1, right? They played Joaquin, a team played in the state semifinal. Garrison, a 9-3 team. Wascom in non-district. That was a 10-win team, right? Palestine Westwood ended up being one of the big surprises in Texas high school football. I think that's an example of us looking from the outside and saying, oh, well, Palestine Westwood, that's not necessarily impressive. And then at the end of the year, you go, oh, yeah, actually, that's very impressive that you played them. Mm-hmm. And out in Shelbyville. Shelbyville was a good team within their district, a 10-win team. And then the six-man ranks, it was Rankin. Rankin went 6-5, but they played an opponent's record of 87-42. And you take a look at some of the teams that they played, okay? Obviously, you know, when they played Whiteface. They played Whiteface in the state semifinal or the second round of the playoffs. That's boosting it as well. But in non-district play, they played Water Valley, who went 11-3. That was a state semifinalist. They played Westbrook in non-district. Remember, that was a team that entered as being in 3 consecutive state championship games. They played Buena Vista in district play, which ended up winning the district. And they played Happy in non-district, a 10-2 Happy team. So, according to the computer, these are the teams that played the toughest schedules in 2024. In the end, who played the toughest schedule in 2024? When you mash all those together, I think there's a couple of options here that appear on all 3 of these lists. Any way you split it, what Atascocita played in 2024, I think, has to be on that very short list.
Oh, yeah.
I would say between them and Aubrey, I would probably put them in the toughest schedule category.
Which, when realignment came out, those were 2 of the premier districts that we talked about, 23-6A, and then what I
think it's 7-4 Division 1.
Yeah, because I mean their schedule was just insane. Yeah.
And so that's a look at a variety of different ways to skin the cat. Which teams played the toughest schedules in 2024? You let us know in the comments which team you think played the toughest schedule in 2024, and we'll get to those comments at some point, or we won't.